In this video, we pick up the discussion of John Donne's Valediction forbidding mourning, a very famous poem, and we pick it up in the third stanza, which is where we left off our discussion in the previous video. Here John Donne says, "Moving of the earth brings harms and fears, men reckon what it did and meant, but trepidation of the spheres, though greater far, is innocent." And what he's talking about here most likely is that moving of the earth refers to an earthquake. An earthquake. And that's literally what happens when there is an earthquake. And in the Renaissance, people often also thought that an earthquake, what happened was that as the ground kind of shook, air was pushed out. And an earthquake is really air being pushed out of the earth. And that ties it back actually to the first stanza where we talked about how the breath escapes the body. And so this conceit or this metaphor here is nicely related because it's also talking in a sense about how earthquakes would expel air out of the solid earth. So what is being compared here is really two things. Things that you can see and experience and feel, which would be something like an earthquake, and then things that are more invisible, things that are happening far away, and you can't necessarily see with the senses, but that maybe have even more powerful effects, a more powerful kind of impact on life. So that's the comparison here. And the reason why John Donne makes this comparison is because earlier in the previous stanza, he had talked about how some people, they focus on outward things. They focus on what they can see, like tears and sighs and things like that. But he's saying those people who truly understand reality know that there's much more than just the externals. There's spirit, there's soul, there's all these other things that are much more difficult to capture. So he's comparing then moving of the earth, an earthquake, to what he calls trepidation of the spheres. And to understand what that refers to, we have to understand what the spheres are. During John Donne's time, there was really a transition that was happening from one particular scientific model of the universe to a new one. And the old medieval model is often referred to as what's called the Ptolemaic universe, named after the astronomer Ptolemy. The basic idea of the Ptolemaic universe is that the Earth is at the center, and all the other planets, as well as the moon and the stars and so on, move around the Earth. So it's Earth-centric as opposed to heliocentric, which is when the sun is in the middle. And heliocentric, this is the Copernican Model after Copernicus. And Galileo later confirmed the same model, roughly around the same time when John Donne was writing. So in the Ptolemaic universe, then you have all of these planets and so on moving around the Earth, and they each move in their own sphere. So each of these kind of sectors, you might say, these are all different spheres, and they're perfect circles, right? The planets move around the Earth in perfect harmony, in perfect circles. Now, astronomers realized that this doesn't quite work out, and they had to make up some very fancy kinds of modifications to the Ptolemaic universe to actually make it work. So just as one example, they talked about things called epicycles, which is where the planet, as it's moving around the Earth, it's basically going backwards, all the way around. And that accounts for the fact that sometimes when you look out at night, you can see a planet that appears to be moving backwards where it's supposed to move in the other direction. So that's a very complex kind of system. And there's much more to an epicycle, but at least it gives you a little bit of a sense of what's going on there. Okay, so we have these perfect spheres then, and I use the word perfect on purpose because the idea is that everything above the moon is eternal and is perfect, whereas things that are under the moon are corruptible. In other words, they can die, they can change, and they are also what's called sublunary or sublunary. So the word sublinary, which you're going to see in John Donne's poem in a moment, this means earthly. It means earthly. And also it has this sense that something is temporary, that it's not going to last forever. So sublinary means not necessarily of great value. Now, as we think about all of these spheres then moving around the earth, we get this sense that there's something very beautiful about this. And I would suggest that if you are fascinated by the Ptolemaic universe, you should read C.S. Lewis's book, The Discarded Image, which really talks about how profound this shift was from this older model to the Copernicus or the Copernican model with its focus on heliocentrism. We don't have tons of time to talk about this model, but if we go back to our poem, I think you can see now that what he's talking about here, trepidation of the spheres, trepidation means a kind of trembling, What he's saying here is that when something happens in the spheres, some kind of wobble, right? So there's a sphere and it's going around the earth. If there's something that happens there far away from the earth, people can't see it, and they don't think it's important. It's innocent, it's harmless, but it actually has quite a powerful impact. And during this period, people really did believe that the planets had this incredible astrological kind of influence on life on Earth. In fact, even today, if you check your horoscope, you're going to find out that the zodiac and the planets and so on, these have an impact, supposedly. All right, so trepidation then can mean a trembling of the spheres. Some people read this very specifically as referring to a movement in the 8th sphere, which affects the 9th sphere and so on. That's very specific, a kind of detailed meaning of this word, but you can also understand it more generally as any kind of movement in the spheres that's not regular and that may have some kind of impact on life on Earth. You can see now, I think, what's going on here. What people are saying is when there's an earthquake, they reckon, they consider, they count, they kind of claim even that it's significant. It brings harms and fears. People are saying an earthquake, oh, it's a sign of the end times, right? And I'm not even joking by saying the end times because there is a passage in the Bible that comes to mind. When you read Matthew 24, verses 6 and 8, where Jesus is talking about the destruction of Jerusalem in the year 70 AD, but this is a passage that's also often meant to, or explained to be about the end times, about the apocalypse. It says there, in the end times you will hear of wars and rumors of wars. There will be famines and earthquakes. All these are the beginnings of birth pains. So the idea then is that if there are a lot of earthquakes and signs and natural disasters, maybe it's a sign that the end is near. And as I mentioned, most likely this is a reference to the year 70 AD, but it is often used with a broader application as well. Okay, so that's the third stanza. It takes quite a bit of explanation, but it really continues this idea of this separation between two different ways of thinking. There are some people who use their senses and can only understand the world through what they can see and experience. And then there are some people who make room for a more spiritual understanding, some kind of reality that goes beyond the senses. We get then to the fourth stanza, and this is where this idea is developed. John Donne says, "Dull sublunary lovers love, whose soul is sense, cannot admit absence, because it doth remove those things which elemented it." The idea here is that those lovers who live under the moon, right, sublunary, who are earthly and are not, in this case, spiritual, their love cannot admit absence. So admit here is cannot deal with, cannot acknowledge, cannot really take in this concept of absence. And John Donne is being very clever here because he's punning on this word sense. So in Latin, ab is a kind of prefix or preposition, and it means from, away from. So literally absence for John Donne means away from the senses. And so there's this play on sense, right? These people, their soul, the way they experience reality, the way in which their spirit moves them, all it is just external senses, touch, taste, and so on. That's all they've got. And that's why they cannot deal with absence. You can imagine that you are dating somebody, and this person is somebody who really loves to touch and to see. And when this person goes away, then the relationship just ends because they can't deal with the distance between the two people. So it as absence doth remove those things which elemented it. Those things are the senses. They're the body parts. They're the ways in which we experience the world. And this notion of elementing continues with all of these metaphors of, first of all, alchemy, as we said in the previous video, of having different elements, right? There are 4 elements, earth, water, fire, air. And I think it also ties in with this larger notion of, well, how is the universe composed? What makes up the universe, and how do things connect? Whether it's body and spirit, the earth and the spheres, how are all of these things kind of constructed? All right, then we move on to one more stanza here before we finish this video. And here John Donne says, but we, so here comes the contrast, we by a love so much refined, there's that alchemical idea, right? So alchemy, where we take a particular substance and we play around with it and we try to turn it into something else. He says spiritual love is like some kind of form of alchemy where we create some greater thing. But we by a love so much refined that ourselves know not what it is. It's very difficult to talk about spirituality and spiritual love. He says, enter assured of the mind, care less, eyes, lips, and hands to miss. So for us, if we don't see each other, right, the eyes, if we can't kiss each other, if we can't touch each other with the hands, that's okay, because we are enter assured of the mind. We know that we're going to be faithful. He's not saying, though, that he doesn't care about the body at all. He says we care less. It's still important. He doesn't dismiss the body, but he is saying that that spiritual connection, that elevated sense of love that they have, ultimately will guide them through this separation.